This is a production of Cornell University.
Good evening, and welcome to the third summer session lecture. My name is Charles Jeremy, and I report to the speaker. And introducing Glenn Altshuler to a 2018 Cornell University audience must be a little like introducing Ezra Cornell or Andrew Dixon White would have been to an 1868 Cornell audience. Absolutely unnecessary. But for those of you who don't know Glenn, I'm going to try to introduce him. After earning a Master of Arts degree in history and then a PhD degree at Cornell in 1976, Ithaca College borrowed Glenn for a short while. In 1981, though, he returned to this hill, where he has spent the remainder of his very distinguished career. Glenn is the Thomas and Dorothy Litwin Professor of American Studies in the College of Arts and Sciences, and he has been the Dean of the School of Continuing Education and Summer Sessions since 1991. In addition to serving as Dean, a full-time job in itself, there are at least 4 other parts to Glenn's Cornell life. In addition to being a gifted teacher, he is also a prodigious scholar, a prolific writer, and a truly enthusiastic student advisor. He is the author or co-author of 11 books. He has written more than 1,000 published essays, book reviews, columns, and op-eds. The National Book Critics Circle has cited his work as, quote, exemplary, and Psychology Today has featured his writing as essential reading. At Cornell, Glenn is the recipient of the Clark Teaching Award, the Donna and Robert Paul Award for Excellence in Faculty Advising, and the Kendall S. Carpenter Memorial Award for Outstanding Advising. He is a Weiss Presidential Fellow. He continues to be a strong advocate on campus for high-quality undergraduate teaching and advising, and he counts his friends and stays in touch with hundreds of his former students and advisees. But I neglected to mention that Glenn is also an excellent prognosticator, and that's exactly why all of us are here tonight. Glenn Altshuler, the election of 2018, what's at stake, and what to look for.
Thank you very much, Charles. I apologize, I've got a bum leg, so I'm going to be sitting for this talk. If you have any difficulty hearing me, it's probably because you're hard of hearing. I'm very grateful for that introduction. Introductions aren't always as complimentary as Charles's introduction. Some years ago, my colleague and co-author, Stuart Blumen, was giving a talk at a university in Cambridge, and he was being introduced by the distinguished and cantankerous historian Oscar Handlin, and Oscar Handlin said, "Stuart Blumen thinks he knows something about American urban history. We'll see." So that may be an appropriate way for somebody who wants to talk about American politics and who is wrong so often that he has to rely on the short-term memory loss of his audience for them to come again. So I'm going to talk this evening about the election of 2018. I want to begin by setting the context for the election. Then I'll talk a little bit about what to look for in the run-up to election night, and then some signs for you to follow as you're following the election. First, the context. Motivated by a belief that power corrupts Americans, more than citizens in other modern industrial nations, privilege individual autonomy, free enterprise, and social mobility. Although the size and scope of the American government has expanded enormously during the last century, Americans continue to express skepticism about big government and advocate limitations on authority of executives and legislatures to regulate behavior, to levy taxes, and to distribute revenues. Over the past 30 years and more, these attitudes have informed the political agenda of both parties and the response of the electorate. Americans, it's important for you to understand, are uninformed about politics, indifferent to politics, and they loathe politicians. Here is one example of perceptions of the voters for what a member of the legislature stands for. And as you can see there, confusion, deadlock, indifference, playing politics, wasting time, wasting money, general futility, salary grabs. That defines a politician. Or here, let's look at another graphic of American attitudes. This was for a mayoral election. Wanted a big man to fill it, November 7th. And who are the people who are at the bottom of the screen? Boss-owned candidate, party hack, figurehead, petty politician, frenzied reformer, and so on. Those attitudes have existed in the United States as long as there has been a United States. So Americans don't follow political issues closely or at all, and they tend to be particularly skeptical of professional politicians. Obviously, that's played a role in who Americans vote for and who they oppose. In recent years, on top of that political lack of knowledge, on top of the loathing for politicians, has come a political and partisan polarization, the likes of which we have not seen in the United States, in my judgment, since the Civil War. It is polarization that is, if anything, bad and getting worse. And it manifests itself in the electorate as well as among the professional politicians. And it is a tremendous danger. During the past 40 years, the political parties have become more ideologically homogeneous than they have in decades and decades and decades. Most Northern Democrats sponsored civil rights legislation, as you know, in the 1960s and 70s. And so the once solid Democratic South has become the now solid Republican South. The Southwest has become a bastion of republicanism, and the Democrats now are confined in essence to the coasts, West and East Coast, and some northern Midwestern states. This has meant that The Republican Party has lost its moderates, as has the Democratic Party by and large. The Democratic Party has moved left, the Republican Party has moved right. Let me illustrate this with a couple of statistics. According to a study by the Pew Research Center for the People and the Press, 92% of Republicans, this is the electorate, 92% of Republicans are to the right of the average Democrat. 94% of Democrats are to the left of the average Republican. That means there's no real ground ideologically for either of them to come together. And the politicians, as we'll see, are even more polarized than the electorate. Let me also make sure that I remind you about myths of independent voters. Independent voters are usually portrayed as the most thoughtful of American voters. They're waiting till the last minute. They're weighing the evidence very, very carefully, and then they're deciding, this time, do I vote for the Democrat or do I vote for the Republican? Unfortunately, that is not remotely true. Most people, the overwhelming percentage of people who identify as independents are not independents. They vote almost uniformly for either the Republicans or the Democrats. They like to think of themselves as independents, but they don't vote that way. And those who are independents are among the least well-informed voters in the United States. They follow politics even less than the Democrats and the Republican voters, who don't follow it very much at all. So what we have is a polarized electorate, a polarized professional politicians, and a independent cohort that I think most political observers say is no larger than 5 or 10% of the electorate, despite what you've heard about the growth of independence. That political polarization is also exacerbated by the siloing of sources of information. This is one of the most important developments in American politics, and one of the most troublesome. 2/3 of Americans get a lot or most of their political news from social media. Anybody want to hazard a guess about how many, what percentage of Americans get most of their political information from newspapers? 8%. About 8%. So, and the outlets for news have become more highly partisan. So, if you're a Republican, you get your information from Fox News and Breitbart and social media outlets. If you're on the left, you watch MSNBC and you think Rachel Maddow is just the cat's meow, and you get social media outlets on the left. Studies have shown that people's attitudes vary dramatically depending on where they get their information from. And you can tell yourself, if you're a Democrat, watch Fox News for a couple of hours and see how the Trump administration is portrayed. If you're a Republican, swallow hard and watch MSNBC and see that it's Mueller time all the time on MSNBC. And we know how that is being framed on either side. There is also something that the journalist Bill Bishop calls the big sort. People now live in neighborhoods of like-minded other people. They're not encountering other perspectives or other points of view. And here is a statistic for you that will make this point. More Americans say they would be upset if their son or daughter married someone from another political party than say they would be upset if their son or daughter married someone of a different race or a different gender orientation or a different religion and so on. And another Pew study, 30% of Democrats and 40% of Republicans believe that the policies of the other party are a threat to the well-being of the United States. This will begin to tell you why we are locked in as a divided nation ideologically. Okay, so I've talked about political indifference. I've talked about political polarization. Let me now turn to the issue of turnout in midterm elections. Okay, there's our next slide. It's a turnout slide. Why the bosses win? No, I didn't register. I was too busy. I forgot all about it. Oh, well, a couple of votes won't make much difference. Turnouts in midterm elections are anemic. They vary between the low 30s, 34, 35% of registered voters, and in a year where there's a terrific turnout, 40% of the electorate. In presidential elections, it's 58 or 60%. So it's 1/3 less in midterms. And so midterm elections are always about turning out your base because you're not going to turn out the mass electorate. And of course, our system of primaries make all of these forces that I talked about much worse. If I had to identify one of the biggest dangers to democracy, it would be primaries. Primaries make the vote in the midterm election look huge. Primaries sometimes can be decided by an electorate of 15 or 20% who turn out. Who turns out in primaries? The extremists on both sides. And so, if you combine primaries with gerrymandering, the election doesn't matter because the seat is a safe seat. What matters is whether, and it's a new word in our lexicon, you're going to be primaried. And so if you're a Democrat, you're going to be primaried on the left. Joe Crowley just found that out and was defeated from the left by Ms. Octavio Cortez. Some years ago, Eric Cantor, the minority leader of the House of Representatives, and a very conservative candidate, was defeated from the right in a primary by a candidate who was a professor and had the appropriate name of Brat, which fits almost all professors, it seems to me. And the total turnout, if you look at how many voters turned out, it was about 15% of the electorate that had Eric Cantor displaced by David Brat, who is now in the House. So we have polarization from primaries and gerrymandering. We have a very low turnout in midterm elections. And if I haven't made you sufficiently depressed, you should also understand, and I'll illustrate this in a moment, that for good and ill, primaries have almost nothing to do with issues. Almost nothing to do with issues. Now, there may be some solace in that, as I'll illustrate in a moment. So, those are the factors, the context for understanding this election. One more important piece of information about midterm elections. Midterm elections almost always favor the party who is not occupying the White House. Almost always. There are only 3 or 4 exceptions to this, going back almost 100 years. The party out of power, out of the White House, almost always gains seats in a midterm election. Now, the number of seats on average that the party gains, now I'm just talking about the House of Representatives, is between 25 and 30. But that number is a little bit too large because it factors in a period before there was such gerrymandering of seats as to make fewer and fewer seats competitive. In 2018, there are 435 members of the House of Representatives. All the members of the House of Representatives are up for re-election. The number of contested seats is about 60. All the rest of the seats are safe seats. So, because of gerrymandering, because of the way that American politics has been regionalized, because of the relative power of rural districts as opposed to urban districts, because of shenanigans to some extent. But if you're trying to flip a House of Representatives, you've only got about 60 or so seats in play, maybe 70, that you can even contemplate flipping. So let's now turn to this particular election. And I'm going the wrong way. Yeah, no, here it is. Okay, so why are there no issues? Because that's what people think all elections are about. Splat. And it is fair to say that each time we have an election, I predict with some certainty that it will be the dirtiest election in American history. And I'm willing to go out on a limb and say a new record will be set in 2018. It's a pretty safe prediction to make. So what are the factors in this election? First, let's take a look at the Democrats. People say, certainly my academic, my professorial colleagues, a lot of some of the pundits say, well, the Democrats don't have a national message. They're divided on what they should say. There's a rift between their left and their moderate Democrats, and so on. In my judgment, it doesn't matter. There's one issue in midterm elections. It's a referendum on the president. And that's it. And there'll be other issues talked about. Let me tell you, this election for the Democrats is not going to stand or fall on whether people think the Democrats are going to abolish ICE in the election. Most electorates will think that that has something to do with global warming. That those issues are inside baseball issues that people don't follow. And the reason that the party out of power does better is that when you win a presidential election, that's usually maximum achievement for your congressional candidates as well, and they're somewhat vulnerable 2 years later when the president is not heading the ticket. And of course, this president does not have a high approval rating. I checked today, according to Nate Silver's 538, and that's the source that you should look at. The poll of polls indicates that the president's approval rating is 41%. Poll of polls. That is good news for Democrats. I'll return to that in a moment. To the extent that the Republicans have an issue, it will be, this was from 1928, I think. You'll see, can you see at the top it says, drain the morass. That's because people had a larger vocabulary in 1928. They would say drain the morass now if people knew what the morass was. So morass has become swamp. The issue is pretty much the same. And in my judgment, the Democrats are going to run all kinds of ads about $31,000 expenditures for dining room tables, first-class flights, buying used mattresses from Trump Tower, and so on. Why? Because voters understand that. It brings it down to a kind of series of ideas to which voters can respond. And it's a winner for the Democrats. Many of you don't remember, but when the Republicans had their surge, it was over a check-kiting scandal in the House of Representatives, where representatives were permitted to cash checks in a House bank when they really didn't have enough money to cover those checks. The issue was pretty trivial as corruption goes, but it's the kind of corruption that you can demonstrate fairly easily. Healthcare will also be an issue for the Democrats. The Republicans are vulnerable on the healthcare issue, and that's one issue where, again, people know what they're paying for their healthcare. And if there are going to be issues, there are going to be issues related to, in my judgment, on the Democratic side, to corruption, to health care, maybe to tariffs if they begin to bite, although I'm skeptical about that, and to family values. The Democrats have an opportunity to seize the family values issue in a particularly potent way in this election, not least because of the immigration separation of families. And this is really important for the Democrats because if they're going to flip the House of Representatives, they're going to do it with women, educated women who are affluent suburban voters. The flippable districts are going to be flippable for that reason. And there is, at least at the moment, the largest gender gap in American history between men and women. I think it's unlikely that there'll be a massive turnout of African Americans. I think it's unlikely there will be a massive turnout of Hispanic, Latino voters for the Democrats. I'm also pretty confident that there will not be, and I'm looking at some of the young people here, the turnout of young people in American elections is pathetic. And in midterm elections, it's even more pathetic. Something like 15% of eligible young voters turn out. So the traditional Democratic constituencies may not be constituencies they can rely on in this election, and it's going to be women who will either carry them to control over the House or not. Where will the Mueller report fit in? Russian interference in the election, North Korea, not much. Even in presidential elections, foreign policy is not all that important. Voters don't follow it very closely, and I very much doubt that it will play a large role. Now, on the Republican side, the Republicans are better at turning out their base than Democrats, largely because Republican voters tend to be somewhat more affluent and somewhat more well-educated. What the Republicans will run on is a strong economy, and the economy is very strong. Unemployment is at historic lows. The Republicans will run on judges because that's appealing to Republican voters as something that the party has delivered to them. Republicans will appeal to their base on what's called border security. And Republicans will run, as they have for the last 74 years, against Nancy Pelosi. If Nancy Pelosi were to have a stroke, the Republicans would be in deep trouble. They have run successfully against Nancy Pelosi since her husband's bar mitzvah. And they will do that as long as she remains in office. It's getting a little threadbare, quite frankly, but it still resonates in some areas. Remember, midterm elections involve getting out the base. That's why you have the political rhetoric that you've heard both from the president and other Republicans and from Democrats. That's what midterm elections stand or fall on, turnout in the base. So it's going to be targeted districts, those suburban districts which were either close or carried by President Trump by 5 to 10 points, will be pivotal in this election. I'll tell you in a minute where to look to find those races. The Democrats, I predict, are going to witness very soon the return of Barack Obama. I think he will be used in swing congressional districts that have an African American population above 15% of the eligible voters. And he probably can't wait to get out there. And I think it's very likely that he will get out there. Polls indicate, by the way, that in a presidential race between Barack Obama and Donald Trump, Barack Obama would get 56% of the vote, and Donald Trump would get 37 to 39% of the vote. So it's not risky for Barack Obama to get out there and campaign. The Republicans have to have a base-related campaign with President Trump not on the ballot. That's a little difficult to do. And because it's not a presidential election, then Democrats in these swing districts can say, for example, as Connor Lamb did in Pennsylvania, I won't support Nancy Pelosi for Speaker of the House if I'm elected. They can distance themselves depending on local circumstances. Same thing with gun control, for example. They don't have to take the stance on limiting guns that many Democrats want them to take. Republicans have a much tougher time because if they break with President Trump in moderate districts, they risk losing the Trump supporters. I don't think the Democrats run the same risk. There is an enthusiasm gap between Democrats and Republicans that is sizable and perhaps growing, and that enthusiasm gap generally tracks turnout. And that means that, at least at the moment, the Democrats have a turnout advantage. So let me now turn to some things for you to look for. There are two websites that I recommend that you use, and I check them about every 15 or 20 minutes or so. I'm a little anxious that I have to talk to you this long without checking and making sure that I'm on target, but you, at least a number of you, look like nice people, and I don't mind doing that. The best websites are 538. Nate, just Google Nate Silver 538. And Nate Silver is really good at aggregating polls. He doesn't aggregate Romanians that well, but he aggregates polls with extraordinary proficiency. Does everybody know what it means to aggregate a poll or polls? We tend to watch the news and we hear a poll and we have a heart attack because it shows that the person we like or don't like is either going up or going down. Nate Silver takes all key polls and he weights them for bias, track record, the number of people they interview, and so on. And he gives an aggregate of polls. There are two polls, poll aggregates to look for with Nate Silver. One is the president's approval rate. The president's approval rate right now is 41% in a poll of polls. If President Trump's approval rate goes below 40%, the Democrats have a much better chance of winning. If President Trump's approval rate goes up to 45%, I don't think it's going to go above that. It has never gone above that during his presidency. Then the Republicans have a much better chance of winning. The second poll aggregate to look for on Nate Silver's 538 is what's called the House of Representatives generic ballot. That means pollsters say to you, would you vote for a Democrat or a Republican? Forget about who's running or your district. Would you vote for a Democrat or a Republican? At the moment, the Democrats have a 7.5% advantage in the generic ballot. Now, because of gerrymandering, because Democrats are concentrated in a small number of electoral districts, which they win 95% to 5, in my judgment, the Democratic generic poll advantage needs to be at least 7% for the Democrats to win control of Congress. If the generic poll is north of 9% in the run-up to the election, it will look very good for the Democrats. If it's 6% or south, I do not think that the Democrats will flip the House. So that's Nate Silver. If you get into it, you can spend your whole day with Nate Silver, but don't do that, because you should then go to the Cook Political Report, C-O-O-K, Charlie Cook's political report, and he tracks all the races, and he will give you a graph which shows safe seats for Democrats and how many there are safe seats for Republicans, leaning Democrat, leaning a Republican, contested, toss-up. And he is the best of all of the commentators at what he does. And it's worthwhile to look at it. In the last couple of weeks, there's been a bit of a drift toward the Democrats. And another respected website run by Larry Sabato of the University of Virginia, for the first time has said there's more than a 50% chance that the Democrats will take the House. Now, this ebbs and flows, and I told you how indifferent Americans are to politics. They're even more indifferent to politics in the summer. And so the race really won't begin until the fall. So let me take you now to, I want to leave some time for questions, but let me take you now closer to election night itself. What should you be looking for on election night? You should learn a lot. I love it when elections can be forecast by outcomes in the East. because by the time polls close, I'm in my pajamas with the little feet in them. I don't really want to wait until Hawaii comes in. It's tough on my colleagues like Charles the next day. I'm a little crabby. So here's a map for those of you who are like me and want to go to bed either in despair or with glee early on. Here's what to look for. Let's start with our own wonderful New York State. New York State has only 2 contested races, in my view, and our district is not one of them. Those of you who are thinking of contributing to one campaign or another, find a more contested race than the one here. This race is a safe seat. If Claudia Tenney, who is a congresswoman, this is her first re-election, and it is a district that has been very slightly Republican district, and interestingly enough, John Hanna, her predecessor in that seat, has endorsed the Democrat in the race. If Claudia Tenney loses, then the Democrats are looking good. If John Faso, the other incumbent Republican who is in a contested race, loses, the Republicans are in trouble. 2 flips in New York, and those are the 2 candidates, would be quite significant. Pennsylvania, as you know, also had a court-mandated redistricting. The Democrats need to pick up, in my judgment, at least 4 seats in Pennsylvania. If they pick up 3, you may have to stay up late. If they pick up 5, you can think about going to bed early. In New Jersey, if Leonard Lance, an incumbent congressman, loses, he's a Republican, that does not bode well for the Republicans. So these 3 states will begin to tell you quite a bit about the outcome. The Democrats have to win 23 seats in order to flip the U.S. Congress. I think at least 4 or 5 of them have to come out of Pennsylvania. I think 4 or 5 of them have to come out of California. So that's what you're looking at. They're not going to come out of Idaho. Wyoming is looking pretty good for the Republicans. I think there is only a population of about 20 or 30 people in Wyoming, so they only get 1 congressperson. That's what it needs to look like in the House of Representatives. Let's turn for a moment to the U.S. Senate. Here I will say that it's extremely unlikely that the Democrats will take control of the United States Senate. In fact, I will be shocked if they do. You don't really care whether I'm shocked, but I think it's extremely unlikely because the Democrats have 10 incumbents from seats that were carried by Donald Trump, and the Republicans have at most 3 vulnerable Senate seats: Nevada, Arizona, and maybe Tennessee. So again, when you're looking to elections, the most vulnerable Democratic senators are Claire McCaskill in Missouri, Bill Nelson in Florida, Governor Scott in Florida, who's running for the Senate seat, is airing commercials showing Bill Nelson sleeping during a lot of Senate hearings. That's usually not a great sign for enthusiasm for Senator Nelson. Claire McCaskill, Bill Nelson in Florida, Joe Donnelly in Indiana, Heidi Heitkamp. Who could be named Heidi Heitkamp? You know, that's kind of a big disadvantage for her anyway, it seems to me. It's kind of makes a mockery of alliteration, I think, in some way. And I think her parents should be talked to, really, about that. But whatever is true about her name, she's from a state that is overwhelmingly a Trump state. So those are the most vulnerable: Donnelly, McCaskill, Heitkamp, and Nelson. People talk about how West Virginia went for Trump by 20 or 30 points. I think Joe Manchin's going to be reelected in West Virginia, and I think John Tester is going to be reelected from the Senate in Wyoming. I think they're actually in pretty good shape at this point. Montana, excuse me. Yes, and so I think that that it could be that the Republicans will flip 2 or 3 Democratic seats. It could be that the Democrats will flip 2 Republican seats. Maybe it'll be 1 seat that the Republicans gain. Not going to be a significant flip one way or the other, and I just don't see. The Democrats would have to reelect all of their incumbents and flip some of those Republican seats. It's a little unlikely. But let me, for those of you who are Democrats, and I suspect there are a few of you here who are Democrats, for those of you who are Democrats, there's an interesting statistic. Take it for what you will. This tells you something about midterm elections. In a midterm election, an incumbent senator from the opposite party of the sitting president, who is running in a state which the president carried by less than 10 percentage points, is virtually always reelected. Virtually always. And believe it or not, incumbent senators who are not from the president's party, who are running for reelection in a state that the president carried by 10 to 20 points, are also almost always reelected. Not with near unanimity as those in the other category, but significantly. So it's going to be a challenge for the Republicans to flip those seats. But remember, those statistics come from a somewhat less partisan period, and that's important for you to know. So let me end with 2 messages for you, and then I think I've graciously agreed to take some questions. So here's message number 1. Vote. Those of you who are in the audience, those of you who are students, it doesn't matter if you're less than of age, vote anyway. Won't be counted, but it will be a good show of intent on your part, and it'll prepare you for the future. Those of you who are of age, vote. Why should you vote? And this is the most important point. Because that's the superstructure of democracy. Democracy has a shaky superstructure. we've learned in recent times that it's more fragile than we might have thought. We've learned the degree to which flows of information can be challenged and siloed and blocked. We've learned something about hyperpartisanship and its role in politics. And the founders were right. Democracy depends on an informed and engaged electorate. The American electorate, alas, is not very well informed, not very much engaged, and 2018 is going to be something of a test for the electorate, and whether the electorate will turn out remains to be seen. So thank you for turning out on this rainy day. And now, following the spontaneous applause, I will be happy to take any questions.